Every man in the territory knew Denver was broken. He'd spent 5 years married, with no child, seen 3 frontier doctors who gave him no answers, and buried his wife before he turned 40. When he placed a matrimonial ad for a mail-order bride, he expected a woman from back east who understood silence and didn't ask questions about things that had no answers. What stepped off that stagecoach instead was a Japanese woman carrying a lacquered box of herbs and needles that no frontier doctor had ever seen. Stay until the end to see how 2 strangers from opposite ends of the earth tried to build something the whole territory said was impossible. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The ranch sat in a valley 60 miles south of Cheyenne, bordered by a creek that ran thick in spring and thin by August, with the Wind River Range cutting a jagged line against the sky to the west. Denver had built it with his own hands over 12 years, fenced it section by section, dug the well, raised the barn, married Sarah in the front room the year the cattle hit 400 head. The land was rich and the operation was sound, and by every measure that mattered to a rancher in Wyoming territory, he should have been the luckiest man in the county. But the house was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the land. Sarah had been dead 3 years, taken by a fever in the middle of a November night, while Denver rode 20 miles for a doctor who arrived too late and charged him anyway. Before the fever, before the silence, there had been 5 years of trying for a child that never came. 5 years of watching Sarah's face each month when the answer was the same. 5 years of sitting across from her at breakfast pretending the disappointment belonged to neither of them until the pretending became the only language they spoke. The town had its own diagnosis. Pity at the general store. The way the other ranchers' wives looked at him with soft eyes that cut deeper than contempt, and the way that pity settled into a man's bones and stayed there like a splinter he couldn't dig out. 3 doctors had examined him over the years. One in Cheyenne sold him a tonic that tasted like rust and did nothing. Another in Laramie told him to pray. A traveling physician who passed through twice a year examined Sarah, found nothing wrong with her, and said so in a way that pointed the question back at Denver like a loaded gun. He never spoke about it, not to Hank, his nearest neighbor who'd been rounding up cattle beside him since they were both 17, and not to the men at the general store who joked about their children and caught themselves when Denver walked in. He carried it the way a man carries a stone in his boot, learning to walk around the pain until the limp becomes indistinguishable from the way he's always walked. The decision to send for a mail-order bride came on a night in February after he'd spent the evening sizing fences and came back to a dark house where the only sound was the wind pushing through the gaps in the window frames. He sat at the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp throwing amber light across the wood and wrote the advertisement on a piece of stationery he'd been carrying for 3 months, waiting for the courage or the desperation to use it. The words came out plain. Rancher, 38 years old, 200 acres in Wyoming territory, seeking a wife, hardworking, skilled in traditional healing, wanting a family. He didn't specify what kind of family or explain why he wanted one, leaving the details for the agency in Cheyenne to sort out. The response came 6 weeks later, a letter describing a woman who was hardworking, trained in traditional medicine, seeking a new life away from the city. There was no photograph, but the agency assured him she was healthy and willing. He sent the travel money and waited through March and into April. When the letter came telling him the stagecoach would arrive on the 14th, he loaded the buckboard before dawn and drove 20 miles to the dry goods station. His hands were tight on the reins, and the kerosene lantern, swinging from the wagon frame through amber light, through the pre-dawn dark, like a promise he was afraid to make. The stagecoach pulled into the dry goods station at 6:15. The horses lathered and blowing, the wooden wheels grinding to a stop, and a cloud of dust that hung in the morning air like smoke. Denver was waiting beside the buttboard, holding a creased photograph the agency had sent in their last letter, a picture of a woman with light hair and a round face who looked like she'd grown up on a farm in Ohio. He'd studied the photograph so many times the edges had gone soft, and he'd built a version of her in his head, someone sturdy and plain-spoken who wouldn't need explanations for the silences. The door of the stagecoach opened, and a woman stepped down who was not in the photograph. She was small-framed, maybe 5 feet tall, with jet black hair pinned in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her head, and almond-shaped dark eyes that swept the station in one calm pass and settled on Denver without flinching. Her skin was fair, her cheekbones high and sharp, and she wore a kimono, deep blue with a pattern of white cranes along the hem beneath a dust-coated trail coat that hung past her knees. Strapped to her back was a wooden box, lacquered black, the brass fittings tarnished with age, about the size of a saddlebag, but rigid and carefully balanced. The station agent stopped loading crates and stared. 2 men standing outside the livery across the road turned to look. Denver looked at the photograph in his hand, then at the woman standing in the dust, and his face went hard in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the floor dropping out from under a plan he'd spent months building. The stagecoach driver was already unloading her bag, a single canvas valise, and he set it on the platform and looked at Denver with the expression of a man who's delivered the wrong cargo and doesn't want to be there when the customer figures it out. The woman Maishi stood where she was and watched Denver, the way you watch weather coming across the valley, with patience and without fear, and she didn't beg or explain or apologize for being exactly who she was. Denver almost told the driver to take her back. The words were in his mouth, shaped and ready, and then the stagecoach lurched away in a cloud of dust, and the moment closed behind it, like a door swinging shut. He looked at the woman, at the lacquered box on her back, at the single bag on the platform, and something in her stillness, the fact that she'd crossed an ocean and half a continent to stand in this dusty street, stopped him. Denver picked up the bag and put it in the buckboard without a word, and they drove home in silence that felt like a third person in the wagon, Mitchie watching the land scroll past with an expression he couldn't read. The first week was a study in 2 people orbiting each other in a space too small for either of them to disappear. Michi moved through the ranch house with an efficiency that bordered on ritual, cooking meals from whatever Denver had in the pantry, cleaning what was already clean, mending the curtains Sarah had sewn 10 years ago without being asked. She rose before Denver and slept after him, and every morning she appeared in a clean kimono, a different one from the day before, her hair pinned in the same knot, her posture the kind of straight that comes from years of training rather than years of trying. Denver didn't know what to do with her. He'd expected a woman who would blend into the rhythm of the ranch, work beside him in the garden, sit across from him at meals, and eventually, maybe, share his bed without either of them needing to talk about what they were doing or why. He'd expected someone who understood the frontier the way he understood it, as a place that doesn't care about your feelings and rewards only the work. What he got was a woman who felt like she belonged in a painting, kneeling on the kitchen floor to scrub it with a cloth, moving with a precision that made the rough plank walls look like they should be paneled in cedar. Hank rode over on the 4th day to welcome the new bride the way neighbors do when they've been watching a man live alone for 3 years and want to see if the loneliness has broken him yet. He stopped short in the yard when he saw Michi kneeling in the garden, planting seeds in rows too precise and too close together for a frontier kitchen garden, her kimono hiked above her knees, her hands working the soil with the focus of someone performing a ceremony. Hank's face went through surprise, confusion, and something harder, and he looked at Denver with an expression that said more than any sentence could have. Japanese? She's my wife. Hank opened his mouth, closed it, and nodded in the way men nod when they're filing something away to discuss later with other men. He left without staying for coffee, and Denver watched him ride toward the ridge and understood that by sundown the whole county would know. In the garden, Michi was growing herbs Denver didn't recognize, plants with serrated leaves and thin stems that looked nothing like the beans and squash Sarah used to tend. He asked her once what they were standing in the garden doorway with his hat in his hands, and she held up a leaf for him to smell. The scent was sharp and green and unfamiliar, somewhere between sage and mint, but neither, and she spoke one word: medicine. She didn't elaborate. She turned back to her planting, and Denver stood in the doorway and watched her work and realized he'd married a woman whose language he didn't speak, whose skills he didn't understand, and whose presence in his house made less sense each day. He found her one night by lamplight, the kerosene flame flickering amber across her face, sorting dried herbs from the lacquered box into smaller pouches, each one labeled in characters he couldn't read. The box was old, the lacquer cracked along one edge, the brass fittings worn smooth. Michi closed it when she saw him standing there, and the sound of the lid was the sound of a conversation that wasn't ready to happen. Denver took the fall on a Thursday, 2 weeks into an arrangement that still had no name. He was fixing fence line in the south pasture where the posts had rotted through when his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and went down sideways. Denver hit the ground with his full weight on his right leg and felt the skin split open on a rock buried in the grass. He limped a mile and a half back to the house with blood running into his boot and a pain in his thigh that made his vision swim. When he pushed through the door, Michi was already there, already moving, already pulling a cloth from the shelf and boiling water on the stove. Before he'd said a word, she cleaned the wound with a boiled herbal wash that stung less than whiskey and smelled like the garden she'd been tending, and she packed the gash with a poultice of crushed leaves that stopped the bleeding in minutes. She bound it with cloth strips torn from a clean wrap, her hands steady and quick, and Denver sat on the kitchen chair and watched her work and felt something shift in his understanding of who she was. This wasn't frontier first aid, the kind you learn from trial and error and a lot of scars. This was something older, something trained, something that came from a tradition he'd never encountered. While he sat, she did something he didn't expect. She took his wrist in her fingers, 2 of them pressed to the vein below his thumb, and closed her eyes. The hold lasted a long time, long enough that Denver started to pull away, and then she asked him to open his mouth. She looked at his tongue, the color, and the coating, and pressed his abdomen in 3 places, low, just below the navel, watching his face each time for a reaction he couldn't hide. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and what she said next was not what any frontier doctor had told him. A fever. Years ago, the heat settled in places it shouldn't have stayed. Denver's jaw tightened. The fever she was talking about was the one that had swept through the territory 9 years ago, the one that had nearly killed him and had killed 3 of his neighbors, the one that Sarah had caught 3 years later and hadn't survived. He'd never connected it to the other problem, the one that sat in the room like a piece of furniture no one acknowledged because no doctor had ever thought to look. She told him she'd seen it before, in Kyoto, in men who'd survived certain illnesses and carried the damage forward in ways they couldn't feel. Her voice carried the same flat, certain tone she used for everything, as if she were describing the weather rather than naming the thing Denver had spent 8 years being ashamed of, and the calm in her voice did more to crack open his defenses than any sympathy could have. She opened the lacquered box. Inside, arranged in neat compartments, were dried herbs in paper pouches, each labeled in Japanese characters. A set of needles so fine they caught no light, laid in a silk roll. A small ceramic mortar and pestle, the glaze. Crazed with age, she picked up one of the pouches and held it where he could see it. "I can help." What she offered wasn't a promise or guarantee, just a statement of capability, spoken the way a carpenter offers to fix a door. She had the confidence of someone who has done the work before and knows what the tools can do. Denver looked at the box, at the needles, at the woman kneeling on his kitchen floor with his blood on her hands, and he understood that he was being asked to trust a stranger with the one thing he'd never trusted anyone with. Denver rode to town for supplies 3 weeks into the treatment, on a morning when the sky was low and gray and the wind carried the smell of snow from the mountains. The general store was the kind of place that served as post office, feed depot, and social center for a 100-mile radius, and on a Saturday morning it held every rancher within a day's ride who needed nails, flour, or someone to talk to. The silence when he walked through the door was the wrong kind, the kind that happens when a conversation stops because the subject of it has arrived. Denver had been the subject of conversations before, after Sarah died, after the years of no children, but this silence was different. This one had a new ingredient. Garth, the storekeeper, leaned across the counter with the expression of a man who's been holding a question for 3 weeks and can't hold it any longer. "Heard you married a Chinawoman." The word was wrong, and Denver knew it was wrong, and correcting it would mean explaining more than he was willing to explain to a man who sold flour and nails for a living. He set his supply list on the counter and said nothing, and the silence in the store thickened. "She know anything about ranching? That kind usually don't." A man at the far wall, a rancher named Dale, who ran sheep on the next range over, laughed in the way men laugh when they want the room to know they find something funny. 2 others shifted their weight, their eyes fixed on Denver with the wariness of men watching trouble start. Denver picked up his supplies when Garth set them out, paid in cash, and turned for the door. He was almost outside when Garth's voice caught him, louder now, pitched for the room rather than the counter. "What kind of woman crosses an ocean to marry a man she's never met? You ever think about that, Denver?" Denver stopped. His hand rested on the door frame, and for a moment the only sound in the store was the creak of the floorboards under his weight. He turned around, and his face had the kind of stillness that men who've known him for 20 years recognized as the moment before something permanent happens. "That's my wife." He said it without raising his voice, without clenching his fists, without any of the performances a man puts on when he wants to seem dangerous. He said it the way you state a fact, and the room went quiet, not from fear, but from the recognition that a line had been drawn and the man who drew it wasn't moving. He rode home in the dark, the kerosene lantern swinging from the buckboard, the amber light painting the road in moving shapes. He didn't tell Michi about the store, but she saw the tightness in his jaw at supper, the way he checked the rifle by the door before he went to bed, and she didn't ask. She brewed his evening decoction and set it on the table without comment, the bitter, earthy tea that had become part of the nightly ritual, and she sat across from him in the lamplight while he drank it. That night he asked her why she'd come to America. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the kerosene flame, at the shadows it threw across the kitchen wall, and when she spoke, her voice was the same flat, controlled tone she used for everything, but the weight behind the words was heavier than any of her herbs. I lost someone. Staying meant drowning. She didn't say who, and Denver didn't ask, and the silence that followed was the first one they'd shared that felt like understanding rather than distance. 3 months into the regimen, Denver's mornings had taken on a shape he recognized as a ritual, even if he'd never have used that word. He woke before dawn to the sound of Michi grinding herbs in the ceramic mortar, the rhythmic scrape of pestle against stone carrying through the thin walls like a heartbeat. She measured the dried herbs by hand, peony root and angelica and atractylodes, plants whose names she'd taught him by pointing and saying the word until he could match the leaf to the sound, and she boiled them into a decoction that tasted like the earth after rain, bitter and green and alive in a way that frontier tonics never were. He drank it each morning, standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky lighten over the Wind River Range, and Michi would press his pulse for 30 seconds and check his tongue and nod. The same nod every morning, neither encouragement nor concern, just confirmation that the work was continuing. Then he'd go out to the fences and the cattle and the long, grinding days that used to empty him by sundown, and she'd tend the garden and prepare the evening dose and wait. His body was changing in ways he could feel but couldn't name. He slept deeper than he had in years. The kind of sleep that came without dreams and left him clear-headed at dawn. His hands didn't go numb in the cold the way they used to when he rode fence line in the early hours. The chronic ache in his lower back, the one he'd stopped noticing years ago because it had become part of the background of being alive, faded until he forgot it had ever been there. He had energy for the south pasture fence, for breaking the new horse, for the long rides to the upper range that used to grind him down to bone by the time he got home. But the one thing that mattered hadn't changed. The months turned and no child came, and Denver counted the weeks the way a man counts the water in his well during a drought, measuring what remained against what he needed, doing the math in his head every morning and coming up short. Each day his body grew stronger, and each night the silence in the house stayed the same, and the gap between what was healing and what wasn't felt like it was widening instead of closing. On a summer evening, the first warm night of the season, Denver came back from the upper range and found Michi on the porch, watching the sunset turn the peaks gold, and then copper, and then dark. He sat beside her on the step, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the silence was different from the silences of the first weeks, which had been the silence of strangers. This was the silence of two people who'd run out of things they needed to explain. She told him about Kyoto, about the temple gardens where her grandmother had taken her as a child to learn herbs by smell alone, blindfolded, kneeling in the dirt with her fingers in the leaves until she could tell peony from angelica by the texture of the stem. He told her about Sarah, not the dying part but the living part, how she used to sing while she cooked, off-key and loud and completely unbothered by it, and how the house had felt like a different place when the singing stopped. Later that week, he noticed something he'd missed before. Tucked inside the lid of the lacquered box, held in place by a strip of faded cloth, was a photograph. A young woman holding a baby, the image small and worn soft at the edges from handling, the face of the woman blurred by years of thumbs pressing against it. He didn't ask about it. But he understood something about why Michi pressed her fingers to his pulse each morning with the focus of someone who'd run out of time to waste, and why she measured the herbs with a precision that went beyond skill into something that looked like devotion. The frost came in October, 3 weeks earlier than any rancher in the valley expected, and the blizzard followed it like a fist behind an open hand. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night, and by morning the snow was shoulder deep on the fence lines and still falling, the wind driving it sideways in sheets that turned the world white and erased the boundary between sky and ground. Denver pushed himself hard. He was out in the storm before. First light riding fence line on the south pasture where the drifts were building against the posts, digging out the sections that hadn't collapsed yet, dragging calves into the barn when their mothers couldn't reach them. 2 calves froze before he could get to them, and he found them in the morning, curled against the fence, stiff and covered in ice, and he carried them to the barn anyway because leaving them in the field felt like something he couldn't do. On the 3rd day, his horse slipped on a sheet of ice in the corral and went down hard. Denver hit the frozen ground with his full weight on his left side, and he felt his ribs crack before he felt the pain. 2 sharp reports like branches breaking, and then the pain came and took his breath and his vision and his ability to stand. Mitchie found him in the barn an hour later, half conscious, snow in his hair, and blood on his coat where he'd fallen against the fence rail. She hauled him inside, using a strength her frame shouldn't have contained, her small hands braced under his arm, her shoulder against his side, half carrying him the 50 yards from barn to house through drifts that reached her waist. She stripped his wet clothes, wrapped him in every blanket in the house, and brewed a decoction so strong it burned his throat going down. Herbs for the pain and the shock, and the cold that had settled into his bones. She set his ribs with cloth bindings, wrapping them tight enough to hold the bones in place and loose enough to let him breathe, and her hands didn't shake. He watched her work through the haze of pain, and thought with the part of his mind that was still working, that he'd never seen her move this fast, this focused, and that the calm she carried like a garment had layers he hadn't known about. The fever came on the 2nd night. It started as a chill, a shaking that made his teeth rattle, and then it climbed until his skin burned and his thoughts scattered like birds from a gunshot. The treatment schedule broke, the daily herbs interrupted, and Michi sat beside him in the chair by the bed and changed poultices on his chest every 4 hours, brewed willow bark tea for the fever, and slept in the chair with her head on the bed frame when she couldn't stay awake any longer. In the delirium, Denver taught. He talked about Sarah and the 5 years of trying, about the way she'd looked at him near the end with something that wasn't disappointment but was worse, something like grief for a future that wasn't coming. He said things he'd never said aloud, the shame and the anger and the feeling that his body had betrayed him in the one way a man couldn't forgive, and Michi heard all of it and said nothing and kept changing the poultices. When the fever broke, he opened his eyes, and she was there, not pitying, not exhausted, just present, her fingers on his pulse, her face, the same calm surface it always was. She told him the fever had set the treatment back, but hadn't undone it. His body was stronger than it had been 6 months ago. The foundation had held. He asked her why she stayed. The town, the isolation, the hard work, a husband who could barely look at her most days. She could have left a dozen times. She looked at him and said something he didn't expect. Because I've seen worse. And because I promised my grandmother's medicine would not fail you, Denver healed from the ribs, but the fever cracked something open that the bones hadn't reached. 6 months of treatment, and what he wanted hadn't come. He started measuring the failure differently. Not in weeks or months, but in the slow erosion of something he'd been calling hope, and was starting to recognize as self-deception. One morning in November, he told Michi to stop. He said it flat, without anger, the way a man accepts a sentence he's already served. The decoctions and the needles and the daily ritual, it was done. He told her she should go back to wherever she'd come from, find someone who deserved what she could do, because he was finished hoping for something that wasn't going to happen. Michi didn't argue. She didn't cry. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd set his morning cup for 6 months and did something he'd never seen her do. Michi opened the lacquered box all the way, lifted the inner tray, and took out the photograph from inside the lid. She held it where he could see it, turning it so the lamplight caught the faded image. She told him about the photograph. Her daughter was born in Kyoto and lived 14 months. A fever took her, the kind of fever that takes children the way a hawk takes a field mouse, without warning and without mercy, the kind that doesn't care about medicine or prayer or how much you need the child to survive. Her husband died a year later, not from illness, but from something that broke inside him that no herb could reach, and she'd found him in the garden one morning with his hands in the dirt and his eyes open and nothing behind them. She told him she came to America because she couldn't sit in a house where the silence sounded like a child's breathing. She told him she answered Denver's advertisement because it asked for a man who wanted a family, and she understood what that sentence cost a person to write, the kind of cost that leaves a mark you carry in your chest for the rest of your life. She told him the treatment wasn't about herbs. The herbs helped, and she believed in them the way she believed in the sunrise, but the real medicine was something else. It was the decision that his body wasn't the enemy. It was the act of someone looking at the thing he was most ashamed of and not flinching, not looking away, not softening her eyes in that way that made him feel like a child being humored. She told him she couldn't promise him a child, and she wouldn't, because promising was the thing that had broken her husband, and she would not do that to another man. But she could promise that she wouldn't let him call himself broken while she was in this house. Denver sat with that. The kerosene lamp flickered, throwing shadows across the kitchen that moved like breathing. The silence in the room changed. Not gone, but different. The kind of silence between two people who've both lost something and are standing at the edge of trying again, looking down at the distance between here and there and deciding whether the fall is worth the chance of landing. Denver picked up the morning cup the next day. He didn't announce it, or make a speech, or acknowledge what had passed between them the night before. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the bitter decoction, and Michi set it in front of him without comment, and the ritual resumed as if it had never stopped, which was the only way either of them knew how to do it. 3 weeks later, the town tested them again. Hank's daughter, 6 years old, and the only child on the next range over, fell ill with a fever that the town doctor couldn't break. He'd been dosing her with quinine and willow bark for 2 days, and the fever kept climbing. On the second night, Hank rode to Denver's ranch at midnight because he'd heard the stories about Michi's herbs, and the desperation in his voice was the kind that makes a man cross lines he swore he wouldn't. Michi went. She rode in the buckboard through the dark, with her medicine box beside her, the kerosene lantern swinging from the wagon frame and painting the road in amber light. And Denver drove the team and didn't speak because there was nothing to say that would help. She spent 2 days at Hank's house, using a decoction of gentian and scutellaria that she brewed on his wife's stove. She placed needles along the child's arms and legs at points Denver had never seen her use, and applied a poultice of crushed herbs to the girl's chest that smelled like the garden in summer. The fever broke on the second night. Hank's wife sat on the floor beside the bed and cried, and Hank stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, wearing the face of a man who's been proven wrong about the most important thing he's ever been wrong about, and Michi packed her box and left without waiting for gratitude. Hank came to the ranch the following week. He didn't make a speech. He brought a side of beef wrapped in cloth and set it on the porch, and he nodded at Michi when she came to the door, and he told Denver he'd been wrong about her. Denver nodded back, and that was the whole conversation. And the side of beef sat on the porch like a treaty signed in a language neither side needed to translate. The town's temperature shifted. Not all at once, and not completely, because a frontier town doesn't change its mind the way a man changes a shirt. But enough had changed that the women who crossed the street when Michi walked into town started nodding, a small dip of the chin that meant more than any greeting could have. The storekeeper stopped calling her the Japanese and started calling her Michi, and the word sounded different in his mouth than it did in Denver's, less intimate but more respectful the way you say the name of someone whose value you've been forced to acknowledge. Denver's body kept changing. He felt it in the mornings, in the energy that lasted past sundown, in the way his hands stayed warm and his breathing stayed even, and his back stayed straight through the long days that used to fold him in half. Michi examined him again 3 months after the fever setback, pressing his pulse and his abdomen and watching his face for the reactions he'd stopped trying to hide. She didn't claim the treatment was working. Her words were simpler and heavier. "Your body is ready." Her voice held the same calm she brought to everything, and for the first time in 8 years, Denver let himself believe her. Spring came to the valley the way it always did. Grudging and slow, the snow melting off the south pasture in patches that revealed grass the color of old straw. The calves dropped in April and stood on shaky legs within the hour, and the herb garden Michi had planted the summer before came back green and strong, the peony and angelica pushing through the soil like they'd been waiting for permission. Michi told him on a Tuesday morning the way she told him everything. Plain and without ceremony. She was late. She'd been late before, and it had meant nothing, and she'd learned not to trust the signs, because the signs had lied to her once before in a kitchen in Kyoto, and the lying had cost her everything she had. But this time her pulse told a different story. She pressed her own wrist and looked at him across the table, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, her stillness broke. Something crossed her face that he'd never seen there. Not joy, not relief, but something older and more frightened than either. The expression of a person reaching for something they've already watched fall and break. The months that followed were the longest of Denver's life. He watched her the way he watched the sky before a storm, reading every cloud for the shape of disaster, afraid to trust the clear weather because clear weather had lied to him before too. Michi kept working, kept tending the garden, kept brewing his decoctions, even as her body changed in ways she couldn't hide. She didn't slow down, and she didn't rest, and he realized after a while that she was afraid in her own way, the kind of afraid that comes from having already lost the thing you want most and knowing that wanting it again is the bravest and most foolish thing a person can do. The baby came in late summer, born in the ranch house with Michi's own hands, and Denver holding her upright against the bed frame, the kerosene lamp throwing amber light across the room that turned everything gold and warm and temporary. The child was a girl, small and loud and perfect, her lungs working the way lungs are supposed to work, her fists clenched, her eyes shut against the light. Denver held her, and his hands didn't shake, and the silence that had filled this house for 8 years broke like ice in a river, and what flowed in was something he had no name for, but recognized immediately. The way you recognize a sound you've been listening for your whole life without knowing. Michi named the baby after her grandmother. The lacquer box sat on the shelf beside the bed, the photograph inside the lid now joined by a new one, a woman holding a child, the image not yet worn at the edges, but destined to be the way all things held too tightly and too often are destined to wear. The ranch looks the same from the road, with the same fences, the same cattle, and the same wind cutting through the pass. But inside, a child's voice fills rooms that used to hold nothing but quiet. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.